Hi, I'm Neil Nobel, editor-at-large of the Prickly Pear, and welcome to the Cactus Patch. We're pleased today to have with us Dr. William Happer, who is the Cyrus Fogg Brackett Professor Emeritus of Physics at Princeton University, specializing in atomic physics and optics. He has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed, non-plagiarized, I should say, papers, and has served in the Clinton, Bush, and Trump administrations. His last position was as senior director of the National Security Council under President Trump. In 2015, he co-founded the CO2 Coalition. I hope all readers and viewers of Prickly Pear will go to co2coalition.org. That's CO2 Coalition, one word, .org. If there's anything you will get out of this broadcast today, it'll be knowledge of this website. It is a tremendous asset, very well designed and very informative. Kudos, Dr. Happer, to whoever designed that for you. It was terrific. Thank you for being with us today. As a layman, I see all these policy initiatives coming down the pike that affect me. They're going to affect my children, my grandchildren. People are telling us how we're going to be able to cook our food, whether we can use gas stoves, what we're going to drive. It's affecting the cost of electricity. It's got a whole generation panicked about whether or not it's reasonable to have children. If they do, it might destroy the earth. Much of this seems to come over the last 25 years from former vice president and divinity student Albert Gore, and this whole connection of carbon dioxide causing a rise in temperature, and that rise in temperature is an existential threat to the existence of humanity. And therefore, international organizations and the federal government have to grab all these reins of power because of this emergency. You must feel that CO2 is key yourself, or you wouldn't have founded the CO2 Coalition. If you were sitting across the breakfast table right now with me, what would you tell me about CO2, and what would you tell me what's wrong about this theory?
Well, Neil, in my field of physics, there's a joke about theories that getting the sign right is the hardest thing. And so with the CO2 theory, they've gotten the sign wrong. More CO2 actually benefits life and humanity. It does not harm it. And, that's very clear from many lines of evidence, in particular from geological evidence. Over the last 500 million years, that we're over a time we've got good fossil records, so we know a little bit about what happened.
Mhm.
CO2 levels has been much higher than they are today, and life flourished, and that hasn't gone unnoticed today. If you go to a greenhouse in Canada or the Netherlands or Russia, you find usually that it has artificially elevated levels of CO2 inside the greenhouse. The greenhouse operator goes to some trouble to buy sources of CO2 to put into the over the plants, and it costs money. He wouldn't do that if it didn't bring a profit, and it does. Plants grow much better with more CO2. And that's even more true when they're not inside a greenhouse where they have plenty of water. If you look at plants in open fields, they're all growing better today. You can see that from satellite images of the Earth. So the only clear effect of more CO2 on the Earth has been positive. The Earth is greening, crop yields are increasing. They're increasing for other reasons, for fertilizer, better varieties, but a major part has been more CO2. And so you can't put your finger on a single negative consequence of more CO2.
Well, isn't what they point to, their negative is that it is increasing the temperature? Is it increasing the
Well,
temperature?
yes,
I've read some.
temperature has been increasing, but most of that increase is almost certainly a recovery from the little ice age. It got extremely cold in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and finally began to warm up around the year 1800. You can see that particularly clearly if you visit Alaska and look at the glaciers there. They started melting very, very rapidly around the year 1800. And by 1870 or so, most of the ice in Glacier Bay had melted away. And it was so striking that John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club in California, made a special trip to Alaska to look into why there was this massive loss of glaciers. This, by the way, was a long time before we started putting a lot of CO2 into the air. So whatever caused it had nothing to do with CO2. And so he wrote a very fine book called Travels in Alaska, which I recommend. I've read it. It's a lot of fun to read. But he explains that, all this ice is melted. And if you talk to the Indians who live there, they have oral traditions that point out that the ice has melted and receded more than once over the last 1,000 years or so. And that's true. You can tell that from the geological evidence. So we're coming out of this little ice age, and CO2 has probably contributed a little bit to the warming, but more than half is almost certainly just this natural recovery.
So there are a lot of independent variables operating other than the CO2 level, but our temperature is warming somewhat. Uh, I have read other people who say that really isn't, that much of the measurement has been flawed, maybe fudged, heat island effect, and so on and so forth. Are you comfortable with the idea that temperature is rising somewhat?
Yeah, it's true that there are big heat island effects that you have to try and take out of the data, and it's not very reliable. And it's also true that some of the recent data has been fudged. But all you have to do is take this trip to Alaska that I mentioned to recognize that uh, something has caused massive retreats of glaciers there. And that's true in other parts of the world. The glaciers in Scandinavia and the Alps have also been receding. How much of that is temperature and how much is the source is certainly controversial, because what makes a glacier advance and is not just the temperature, it's how much snow falls in the
Mhm.
source areas. And so, for example, Kilimanjaro glaciers have retreated a little bit, but we've got good temperature records. There's been no temperature change on Kilimanjaro, and the retreat there has mostly been due to deforestation around the base of the mountain. So there is not as much snow falling on the mountaintop as there was 100 years ago when there was dense forest and a lot more moisture in the air. It had nothing to do with CO2. It was human caused, but not not from CO2. So
So,
there's lots of mythology out there.
so if most of this is misplaced effort on the part of these advocates, um, we're going to wind up basically with rising temperatures anyways and destroying our basic standard of living in the process. Is that where we're headed?
Well, I hope the American people at least have enough common sense not to do that. I sort of gave up on the Europeans a long time ago. That's why my people are here. And most of us came to America from Europe because we didn't like the way Europe ran. And so I hope that spirit is still with us, that we don't like to be bullied, by elites and experts or nobility, that we make up our own minds based on the evidence as we see it.
Uh, Bjorn Lomborg is someone I admire, and he basically takes the approach that yes, there is some temperature increase, and he seems to buy into the fact that it's anthropomorphic, that it's man caused, but he feels all this money is being spent absolutely insanely, that we could be building seawalls using nuclear power to desalinate, could build air conditioning, be doing a lot of direct mitigation of whatever effect of climate change is on us without this hubristic idea that our tiny contribution to this climate change, we are going to control the climate over 150 years. It just, that alone seems insane to me.
Yeah, it is insane. And, I'm very grateful that Lombard points out how insane it is and how misplaced our priorities are. you know, I think he's entirely too credulous of the scientific base. The scientific base is also a shambles. You know, it doesn't make any sense. It's probably even worse than the economics. But you know, Lomborg doesn't know. You know, he doesn't know any science, so he feels that he can't really question them. But I know a lot of science, and I'm quite happy to question some. There's a lot of nonsense out there.
You know, we've seen the failure of so many of our institutions, and perhaps this maybe is another one of them. But is it that the scientific community is so busy chasing grant money that it's almost impossible to get objective research into this discussion?
Yeah, that's a very serious problem, and not just for science, you know, it's all fields. Medical research is very seriously affected by, you know, grant chasing. And, you know, people who've tried to reproduce papers in that area, yeah, most of them turn out to be wrong. It was just in order to get next year's research funding that it was published. And climate is that way too. Climate at one time was a very small field with a few really smart people working on it. It was a hard problem and it was worth working on, but there wasn't very much money in it. And so you got people working on climate who did it just for the love of knowledge. And then all of a sudden along comes this climate emergency and Vice President Al Gore and the United Nations climate activities, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And money started pouring out into academia and to other organization laboratories to support the narrative that there's a climate emergency. And if you're willing to shade your research in that direction, you didn't have to shade it very much, then money would pour onto you and you would be very popular with your administration. The university would get a cut of the overhead. So it was a pernicious system. It's still operating. And, you know, I don't know quite what we should do about it. You know, I was a researcher myself, and I was always worried about, you know, how am I going to fund my postdocs and graduate students? We have to get the money, and you're sorely tempted to exaggerate everything or figure out how can you curry favor with whatever the current fad is at the funding agencies.
Having acknowledged that, and again, I'm speaking only as a layman who tries to read the news, it seems to me that there is a lot more skeptical and opposition research now coming out than we had a few years ago. Would that be your impression, or where do you think we are in that process?
Well, I think there's a lot more public skepticism than there was, say, 10 years ago. The reasons for that, it's not so much science, you know, because it's impossible, for example, to publish a skeptical article in the mainstream scientific media, you know, completely under the control of the climate establishment, and they will not permit anything that casts doubt on the narrative. But people are beginning to notice, you know, that electricity bills are going up and, you know, the cost of gasoline is not very stable. And they're being told they have to junk their car and buy an electric battery car. And so all of these things are beginning to come to the notice of people who would not have paid any attention 10 years ago. I think another thing that's helped is that most people have lived through the COVID crisis and they look at what happened then, and it was pretty obvious that you know, much of the government didn't know what it was doing. You know, the right hand didn't know what the
Yeah.
left hand was doing. And, you know, policies taken were probably counterproductive. They probably made it worse, and anyone could see that. And so I think that's helped too to cast a little bit of doubt on you know, on the scientific community, at least on government science. And most science is government science. It's expensive. Someone has to pay for it. So that's the government.
We know that a lot of the social media companies cooperated with government agencies to suppress news on COVID. Is that occurring in the climate debate as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's maybe not so noticeable because climate has been a slowly unfolding disaster. It didn't happen over a period of months like COVID.
Right.
So, when things happen slowly, you don't notice them as clearly as when they happen very suddenly. But of course, if Google on CO2 coalition, for example, usually you'll find us at the top of the screen, but then the rest of the screen is covered with demonization of the CO2 coalition, and that's not by accident, that's built into the software,
Yeah.
make sure that they get demonized.
Getting back to the science a little bit, in visiting your website, which I once again want to commend to all of our listeners to go to the website. There's so much material there. You mentioned about see, I'll probably mull this, but the sort of the marginal utility, the absorption of CO2, that an incremental increase in CO2 does not lead to the same increase in temperature. And you gave in one of your discussions a wonderful description of a painting a barn. I wonder if you might just, as we head towards the close of this, explain to our listeners exactly that phenomenon, what you're talking about there.
Okay, thanks, Neil. The point is that CO2, which they call carbon pollution, even though you and I are both made of carbon, is not a very potent greenhouse gas. It's quite puny. So current CO2 concentrations are about 400 parts per million, 420 perhaps. But it almost doesn't make any difference if you were to double that to 800, 840, or whatever, because the CO2 effects on radiation transfer to space, which is what you're worried about. How does the Earth cool itself from the solar heating? That's what's affected by CO2, and it's not affected very much. So if you double CO2, you only affect that by about 1%. So doubling CO2, 100% increase in CO2 only decreases the cooling of our Earth by 1%. And that's very easy to make up with a tiny amount of warming. Less than 1 degree centigrade warming will compensate for that. So without lots of fancy manipulations, the predicted warming is less than 1 degree. If you double CO2, it'll take a long time to double it. We're only increasing by, 2 parts per million per year. So it would be well over a century to double CO2 and get this 1 degree centigrade of warming. And so one analogy I often use is that CO2 is a little bit like paint in our atmosphere. It's like a pigment that you put in paint, like red paint for a barn. If you've got a good can of red paint and you paint your barn red, the barn will look nice and red. And if someone says, well, why don't you really do it right and put on a second coat of red paint? You can do that, but it won't make any difference. The barn won't look any redder after the second coat of paint than it did after the first, because the paint has been carefully designed that one coat is good enough. And so that's what we've got around our Earth today. We've got the paint pigment CO2 in our atmosphere, and it's already all that's needed to make us red or whatever the equivalent color is. If you double CO2, it's like putting on this second coat of red paint. This is a pretty accurate description if you put in all the differential equations and the complicated physics that goes with this. It gives you the same answer that the technical term is that the effects of CO2 are saturated. It's reached a point of diminishing returns.
It's almost as if carbon has become a demon. And you mentioned, we're made of carbon and
Yes.
plants create carbohydrates, and that's how we manage to stay alive. How
Yes, right. The central chemistry of life is the combination of water and CO2 molecules to make sugar, by photosynthesis in plants. And so there are three major ingredients of that: sunlight, water, CO2, that's all. Well, you have to take further steps. You can't make people out of sugar. There have to be proteins and other parts to our bodies, but they're secondary. They come along, and the first step is this combination of CO2 and water to make sugar. And so we're all carbon. You and I both breathe out lots of CO2. You people are often surprised to realize that they emit 2 pounds of CO2 just by breathing every day. And there are 8 billion people, a little more in the earth, and so what is that? 16 billion pounds a day of CO2 just by people living and breathing, and animals do the same, and fungi do the same. So CO2 is just completely natural. It's not a pollutant at all. This is amazing that they've been able to call CO2 a pollutant or carbon pollution. It reminds me of the witch burnings, in the Salem witch trials in the 1690s. The uh, the judges were all they were all with Harvard degrees, and the chief accusers they were, yeah, and the chief
Right.
accusers were Greta Thunberg's age. They were young women. Yeah, and they executed 19 people. They tortured a number of others to death, because they refused to admit that they were witches. And this was not a bunch of rednecks. This was people with Harvard degrees that were pushing this nonsense. In fact, the rednecks didn't really believe most of it. And there was one famous incident where they hung poor George Burroughs, who was a yeah, preacher, like a Pentecostal preacher today, but he's very popular with his congregation. If you were sick or if there'd been a death, George Burroughs was there to help you and comfort you. And yet he was hanged as a, and as he stood on the scaffold, his congregation gathered and they were in a bad mood. This guy is no witch, let him go. And so they said, have him recite the Lord's Prayer. If he's a witch, he can't recite the Lord's Prayer. So poor George got a chance to recite the Lord's Prayer, which he did perfectly and gave a moving speech. And then Cotton Mather comes riding up on a red horse from Harvard, waving his sword and his book that he was selling on how to detect and hang witches, and says, hang him, and threatened the hangman. And so the hangman pulls the rope, and that's the end of George Burroughs. But this was driven by elites. It wasn't driven by the common people. And the same thing is happening today with
I was going
climate.
to
It's
say it
driven by
sounds familiar,
very
frighteningly
familiar. It's
familiar.
very familiar. It's happened before. Yeah.
Where do you think this is going to end? Do you think we'll be able to
I,
beat
I
this
think it will
agenda?
end because I think there will be a disaster in some relatively large country, maybe the state of California, maybe Germany, where the unfortunate population will do everything that's demanded by the crazies, and the results will be so catastrophic that all of a sudden people will wake up and realize, you know, we've been deluded, this is crazy, we've got to stop it. But often that's how human affairs evolve. Things get decided not because of sweet reason and logic, but because some disaster finally picks people up.
Well,
It
the
sort of
farmers,
happened in
I was going to say the farmers in Europe appear to be getting fairly close to that threshold of
They're
activity.
getting close to that. Yeah, yeah. Something like that will have to happen. It sort of happened in Sri Lanka,
Yes.
a few years ago. The government of Sri Lanka announced that they were going to go back to organic farming and going to ban chemical fertilizers, ban, import of oil. And, within a year, the rice crop failed. The price of rice went up by 10. The tea crop failed. There's no income from selling tea. And so the people rose up, they stormed the presidential palace. The president was lucky to get evacuated by helicopter, or they would have hung him. It's too bad they didn't catch him. But that will happen. That will happen at some place, and everybody else will finally wake up. That's my prediction. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, it's better that we stop it in a more humane way.
Well, I hope more people will go to the CO2 Coalition .org website and get educated because I would hate to see this defeated that way. That would be a shame. But I mean, it seems like there's an agenda being pushed, and they are finding every excuse to push it and stifling any skeptic who questions their judgment.
Oh, true, Neil.
Well,
But
Dr.
thanks for
Happer,
what you're doing to try and push back.
I really appreciate your time. We're delighted that you could spend the time you have with. I know you're a busy man. I hope we can chat again at a future date.
That's great. Okay. Take
Thanks so
care.
much.
Bye-bye.